You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to Digging Up Ancient Aliens. This is the podcast where we examine alternative history and ancient alien narratives in popular media. Do these ideas hold water to an archaeologist, or are there better explanations out there? We are now on episode 70, and I am Fredrik, your guide into the world of pseudo-archaeology, and this time we will look at the infamous Kensington Runestone, found in the USA, and also the claims made by Scott Wolter from America Unearthed. Is the stone evidence of Templars and Scandinavians in the US, or is this just a creation in modern times? Remember that you can find sources, resources, and reading suggestions on the website diggingupancientaliens.com together with a transcript of this episode. There you also find contact info and all that good stuff if you're noticing any mistakes or just want to come in contact with me. And I also want to give a huge thank you to all those who are supporting the show through Patreon or the membership portal on the website. If you want to join those fine people and get some bonus stuff, I will tell you exactly how to do this at the end of this episode. This is a rather long one, and well, let's finish up our preparation and let's dig into the episode. Are you tired of wandering around historical sites, wondering if those signs really tell the full story? Well, say goodbye to those frustrating moments with Histourian. Histourian is your guide through history, right at your fingertips. With our app, you can download well-researched historical tours for a number of sites, all written by real humans. No AI here. Imagine having your own private guide narrating the rich history of every location you visit. Whether you're discovering new places or learning new things about your favorite sites, Histourian elevates your experience with convenient and engaging narration. It also works as an audiobook, meaning you can explore new sites from the comfort of your couch. So don't settle for a lackluster experience. Download Histourian today and start your journey through history. Histourian, a guide through history at your fingertips. Available now on App Store and Google Play. Much like an irritating rash, the Kensington Runestone keeps returning when you think it's finally gone. Again, it's popped up due to Scott Wolter's talk during the Cosmic Summit 2024, and also TikToked about by Jenna James, another promoter of pseudo-archaeological claims, and also Lost Civilization. If you're not familiar with Scott Wolter, he is a geologist, but today he's maybe more known as a TV host for the show America Unearthed, one of the entertainment show promoting pseudo-historical claims put out by our favorite, the History Channel. There are conspiracies, Templar, the Ark of the Covenant in the US, and aliens, of course, appearing on this television show. Scott Wolter has also been a staunch advocate for the authenticity of the Kensington Runestone. I will call it KRS going forward, meaning the stone was created by American Vikings or at least Scandinavians some hundreds of years before Columbus arriving in the America. So let's once and for all put this matter to rest, because the case has been closed for some time at this point. But before we get into the nitty-gritty about the Kensington Runestone, we should maybe talk about what it is, where it was found, and when, and whether it really is an important discovery in the first place. Let me take you back in time to the year 1898. A man named Olof Öhman, a Swedish immigrant, is working hard to clear internal improvement land he recently took over in rural Solem in Minnesota. Under a tree stump, he supposedly finds a stone that he first claims might be a Indian calendar, his words, not mine. But the stone was later identified as being written with a runic script. And I will give you the original language here and then you will get the English translation. 8 göter och 22 norrmän på upptagelsefärd från Vinland av väst. Vi hade läger vid 2 skylar, en dags rise norr från denna sten. Vi var och fiske en dag. Efter vi kom hem fann 10 man röde av blod och död. AVM frälse av illu. Har 10 mans vid havet att se efter vore skip. 14 dag rise från denna ö. Ar 1362. 8 Geats and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland to the west. We had camped by 2 skerries, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were out to fish one day. After we come home, we found 10 men red of blood and dead. Ave Virgo Maria, save us from evil. We have 10 men by the sea to look after our ships. 14 days travel from this island. Year 1362. A theatrical yet short story. The explorations, there's death, and of course there's Christianity. Elements that might help us figure out why the stone was made later. And I won't be coy about this. The stone is a hoax. And I'll prove this from several angles. And all roads lead to this being a modern creation. But we should touch on a couple of things before proceeding with Öhman's runestone. It is established that the Vikings were in the Americas before other Europeans started to arrive here. The discovery of Leon's Meadow in the 1970s was a huge deal and did show that the Norse sagas were correct about Vinland. However, this settlement was very short-lived, and if you want to hear more about it, I'll actually have a tour up of the site on the app Histourian relatively soon. There's also a study from 2023 by Lisbeth Gudmundsdottir showing that elite families in Greenland seems to have imported lumber from the America. So today's discussion isn't whether Vikings visited North America, because we know that they did. So even if the runestone would be authentic, it would, as Professor Ken Fader puts it, no cliched writing of textbook would be called for. Maybe just a footnote. And as we will see, however, the importance of the stone is more prominent as a reflection of modern history. I also want to point out that many authors made the mistake of connecting these stones with Vikings. By 1362, the Viking age was long gone. Sweden and Norway were well into the Middle Ages regarding both art and culture in this aspect, and Iceland and Greenland also followed these new influences at this point. So we should stop trying to connect the stone to Vikings, because there's not Vikings at this point. If the stone was real, early Nordic medieval would be a better term for the stone, not Norse or Viking. Let the runes speak. The most significant contributor to the confusion regarding Vikings in Minnesota might be that the stone is written in runes, and I don't think it's weird that people make this association. Still, the issue is that the runic script is not isolated to the Viking age. In Sweden, runes were used for everyday writing up until the 20th century. So people were still using runes when the Indianapolis Motor Speedway was founded and the Manhattan Bridge was opened for traffic for the first time. But runes are not some monolithic writing systems that remain unchanged. No, we have several versions of it, which each can be traced back to different periods in time. And the oldest version of these runes dates back to around 100 CE. The system that was developed is known as the Old Futhark. You might wonder what the Futhark means, and it's basically the ABC of Old Germanic writing system. We have found several stones where all the runes in the Old Germanic alphabet are written out, and the first 6 signs are always the F, U, Th, A, R, and K. The Kulver stone on Gotland in Sweden is the oldest example of a complete alphabet and dates back to around 400 CE. Other examples where we find a complete Old Futhark are on the Vadstena bracteate and the Grumpan bracteate. These are medallions meant to be carried around the neck, a fairly common trinket found during this period in Swedish history. As I mentioned, this writing system evolved, and during 800 CE, the Old Futhark was replaced by the New Futhark. The critical difference between these systems is that the old version contains 24 different runes, while this younger version contains 16. This is a bit of a paradox since we see new types of sounds in the language, meaning more runes would have been better than fewer. But during the 9th century, we see, as expected, a period where rune carvers seem to be able to handle both the new and the old Futhark. And the world's longest runic inscription on stone is found in a small parish called Rök here in Sweden. And this is an example where the carver demonstrating on the stone that it understood both Old Futhark and the New Futhark and the different runes and sounds within these systems. And almost all runestones are written in the younger Futhark. Worth remembering though is that the runestones were carved mainly during the 11th century and that nearly a quarter of all these known carvings in the world are from Uppland in Sweden. During what we could classify as the Viking Age, the young Futhark was the primary writing system. But it would not last. We see yet another change as Sweden, Norway and Denmark enter the early medieval age. The Latin alphabet becomes the primary writing system in Sweden during this era, but the runes are still sticking around here. Again, they change. The runic Futhark is replaced by the runic alphabet. The runes go from 16 back to 24, so you can fill out the Latin alphabet. While most literate people in Sweden would prefer using the Latin alphabet, there were locations in Sweden such as Gotland, Dalarna and Jämtland where the runes would stick around for a much longer time. The runic alphabet was used to write both Latin and Swedish. On a spindle wall found in Jämtland we can read Pax Portani Salus Habenti, which translates to something like peace to the bearer, well-being to the possessor. There's also a shaving kit box with the runic inscription on it that's dated to 1610, but written in Swedish. With this short crash course in Swedish runes, it becomes clear that different periods and regions have their own sets of runes. So where does the runes on the Kensington stone fit in? You might not be surprised that the runes are neither the old or the young Futhark, and I hate to bring bad news, but this rules out Viking involvement. And with the Futhark ruled out, we are left with the runic alphabet. And this gives us a window of 700 years. But of course, we can narrow this gap to a smaller one. The Kensington runes were for a long time a bit of a mystery. No known alphabet we knew about did fit with what we see on the stone. Due to this type of runes has been known as Kensington runes. The first real breakthrough to find where and when the runes were made came when the KRS was on loan and on exhibition in Sweden back in 2003. For the first time, experts in both Swedish and runes could effortlessly examine the inscription. quite quickly they realized that these runes looked like those found on a specific yoke. The runes carved into yoke said "Detta bärträ gjorde jag 10 september 1907 OOS." And if we translate this to English, it says "I made this yoke on September 10, 1907. Perlas Olof Olsson made the inscription in Måndalen, and this is the first connection between Sweden and the Kensington runes. They also quite early managed to connect the runes we find in Kensington to writing that appears in Älvdalen, specifically writing made by Gerda Werf, and this is the region in Dalarna. Due to the yoke's 1907 date, it was a bit of a chicken or egg situation at first. Was the farmer inspired by the stone written about in the news with all those weird runes, or did Öhman learn the signs from the same source? The origin of the Kensington runes, as I said, was a bit of a mystery in general. There's a large variation and different version of runic alphabets out there. Still, none of those that we had really matched the rune that we see on this American piece of stone. And the solution to where these runes came from was a mystery until a few years ago. And the solution came from a rather surprising source, a middle school teacher and her students. In 2019, Anna Björk and her students deciphered runes found in a small Swedish parish called Hassela in the northern province of Hälsingland. While the National Heritage Board of Sweden received documentation of the Hassela runes back in 1980, they received little notice from academics or scholars until Anna Björk and the kids' efforts were celebrated, and the Swedish National Heritage Board awarded them with a Medal of Merit. In addition to deciphering the Hassela runes, there was an additional twist coming from this. The runes used in the parish were identical to those in Minnesota, except these predates Öhman's discovery of the stone, and with this information it did not take long for the veil of the rune's origin to fall. Magnus Källström, a runologist and associate professor at the National Heritage Board, did in 2022 discover more about where the Kensington and Hassela runes came from. He was tipped up by the Regional Archive of Medelpad about a memorial plaque with the Hassela runes on it and the date 1868. On this plaque we can read that it was created to celebrate the wedding between two people, and that part is written in Latin letters. But at the bottom of the plaque we find a line in Kensington runes that says: Denna minnestavla är upprättad under en skrifskola i Hångsta i april månad år 1868. This memorial plaque was erected during a writing school in Hångsta in the month of April in the year 1868. Further down we find a pigpen cipher where we learn more about the writer. Skänkt av författaren såsom ett minne och en belöning för ett välvilligt bemötande av Erik Ström. Gifted by the author as a memento and reward for kind treatment by Erik Ström. Now, Erik Ström was a writing teacher who specialized in offering classes to workers, household staff and servants, and he was active in the mid-northern part of Sweden. In addition to his teaching, Ström published a booklet featuring several writing systems, including the Hassela runes, which notably include the hooked X found on the Kensington Runestone, as well as a pigpen cipher. Later copies of these runes, such as those found in the writings of, or the writing exercises of the Larson brothers, also contain this pigpen cipher. What's more interesting is there appears to be an older and a younger version of Ström Runic's alphabet. And while Ström not have been the original creator, the alphabet can't date much earlier than beginning of the 19th century, and evidence suggests that a younger version of Ström's runes was created after 1880. This conclusion is based on a shift in the runic system that Ström created, and in artifacts like the Haverö staff, the Månsa yoke, and the runes written in Älvdalen. And the most intriguing part in all of that is the runes we find on the Kensington stones are written in this younger version of Ström's runic alphabet. So we know that the runes used can't be older than 1880. Olof Öhman, as you may recall, emigrated to America. Originally, he was born in Forsa parish, located in the Hälsingland province in Sweden, where the influence of Ström's runic alphabet would have been very common and prevalent. Initially, Öhman's surname was Olsson, and this is a very common last name, but he changed it to Öhman upon emigrating to the United States in 1879. And a compelling question arises here. Did Olof have any exposure to Ström's runic alphabet? And the answer here seems to be yes. His first fiancée and cousin, Anna Ersdotter, worked as a vallpiga, that's a shepherdess, in and around Hassela, an area with strong connection to the script, as we mentioned. Moreover, the Olsson family owned land in Kolsjön. This is a region within Hassela. Though Öhman first emigrated in 1879, he returned to Sweden in 1883, staying for several years before heading back to the US. Given the deep connections between Hassela and Ström's runic alphabet, it would be most surprising if Öhman did not encounter this script during his stay in Sweden, and he most likely spent summers in Hassela while the family's cattle was grazing in the area, and this was a common practice. Now, some authors have tried to portray Öhman as a relatively uneducated person, but this doesn't seem to hold up under scrutiny. He was literate, definitely, and seemed interested in both history and language. And one of the books Öhman owned is named Den kunskapsrike skolmästaren, or The Well-Informed Schoolmaster. And this book aims to give the reader understanding on everyday topics. But one section in this book deals with runes and medieval language of Sweden. And given his tie to the area where Ström's script was widely used, it's difficult to argue that Öhman wasn't familiar with these type of runes that we find on the stone. New or Old Swedish? Let's ignore for a moment that the runes used on the stone were created in the 1800s. Instead, we will ask if the language used on the stone is what we would expect to find in medieval Sweden. Again, the answer is no. The language on the stone is not what we see in letters, runestones, or books for that matter, published in the 1300s. Mats Larsson points out that what we see on the Kensington Runestone seems to be a mixture of 1800 Swedish, Norwegian, and English. Something that becomes evident if you are, familiar with the Swedish language. The stone sounds more like the author August Strindberg trying to write a runestone himself than early medieval Swedish. And the National State Archive of Sweden has many written communication preserved from the 1360 and even earlier than that. Now, most of these communications are donations or receipts or sale or land transfer, but they can still be used to understand how Swedes spoke and spelled around the year 1362. And on the transcript page for this episode, I've added 2 examples of medieval letters. One is from Svealand and another is from Götaland. the area where those referred to as Göter on the runestone come from. But I don't think it will give you much if I read them here, because I'm not sure how many of you understand Swedish. I know many of the listeners are from the Americas, so go to the webpage if you're interested in this stuff. A fair point to raise here is that these letters would be written by the upper classes, of course. They might not actually reflect on how the average Joe spoke during this time. Another point is that the letters that we have here is not written in runes. Luckily, we also have many runic medieval inscriptions that we can use. In the Götaland region, we have just 67 inscriptions that has a secure medieval date on them. None have the Kensington or Hassela runes, and none have a language similar to that we see on the KRS. Now, those who think that the KRS is an authentic 14th century runestone, like, for example, anthropologist Alice Beck-Kehoe, points out that some of the words that are found on the stone can also be found in a medieval Swedish language. But to get there, they often sometimes have to go quite far outside Sweden to find this connection, like the word from on line 12. To find a connection to medieval Swedish, you have to go to a dialect found in the Swedish colony in Estonia on the islands of Nuuk and Orm. And the source for this supposed connection is Dr. Richard Nielsen, an engineer, but Kehoe never cites where he makes this claim or where he really got this from. But the best evidence for this stone being a modern creation can be found on line 2. The word upptagelsefarth is not found in early medieval Swedish and would not make sense at all to a person living in this period. Henrik Williams points out that the word seems to be taken from modern Danish, and the word in Danish is uppdagelsefärd, and there's no medieval version of the word. The closest we get to a similar word is the word upptaka in early medieval Swedish, but the word in this case would transfer to the act of clearing land. You know, removing forest, burning, or making it ready to be used as agriculture area or something similar. The language on the KRS is, as we see, a mixture of modern language, and this is not something that sits debated among scholars today that has expertise in early medieval Swedish. To be fair, there are those who don't really agree with this conclusion, one of which we mentioned at the top of this episode, and is the geologist and TV host Scott Wolter, who is maybe one of the most active promoters of the stone's authenticity that's active today, at least. Fellow archaeology lovers, science nerd and history enthusiast, have you ever dreamt of showcasing your passion for our history and science? Dig no further. Welcome to the official merchandise store for your favorite podcast, Digging Up Ancient Aliens. Embark on a journey through time with our exclusive collection. Wrap yourself in the mysteries of the past with our range of themed shirts, mugs, and apparel. Each piece tells a story about your passions and podcast preference. And for the devoted archaeology aficionados, unveil our latest treasure, the Archaeology Mafia t-shirt. It is more than just apparel. It's a statement, a tribute to those who dig deeper, question the unknown, and unravel the secrets of our ancestors. These are not just merchandise. They are future relics from a time yet to be fully understood. Symbols of your dedication to unveiling the truth behind ancient aliens and the real wonders of our past. Join the crew of Digging Up Ancient Aliens, wear your curiosity, flaunt your knowledge, and join the Archaeology Mafia. Visit our store now and you will get an offer you can't refuse. Let's keep the spirit of exploration alive. Log on to diggingupancientaliens.com/store and grab your piece of history. Remember, the past is always present. The hooked X does not mark the spot. Now, Wolter claims that linguists and runologists are all wrong about the stone's language and that it's indeed a 14th century creation. In his book, The Hooked X, he argues that linguists don't see this because they have not realized that the stone is written in Gotlandic. According to Wolter, this misidentification is due to the lack of research on the Gotlandic runestones. And this is a rather bold statement, ignoring much of the work that's been done in the field so far, such as Thorgun Snelldal's excellent dissertation on the Gotlandic language and evolution, and that was published in 2002. And the last part of the Fakismil covering the Gotlandic runestones was published with their preliminary findings in 2004, not 2009, as Wolter claims in the book. These articles also contain previous publication on the stones and inscription that's discussed in this last edition of the Gotlandic runestones. And Wolter's argument here that the stone is Gotlandic or Gotlandic origin is somewhat flight. The stone gives us the origin of the people that made the stone. It's Göter and Norwegian. Göter, not Goth, are what the people from Götaland on mainland Sweden are called and was called back then too in the medieval period. Gutar is what the people of the island of Gotland are and would have been referred to during this time also, not Göter. And Scott Wolter completely ignored this in his book and instead relies on cherry-picking data that fits his conclusion that the language is Gotlandic. Now, Professor Henrik Williams from Uppsala University summarized why Wolter is incorrect in a great 2012 article. The typical medieval Gotlandic S-rune is completely lacking on the KRS stone. But if you look at runestones on Gotland, you will quickly notice that they have this very distinctive Gotlandic S on almost all the stone. And it's strange that such a typical rune is not found on the KRS stone if it was Gotlandic. Williams also point out that Gotland kept its diphthongs for a very long time, and we find them on written materials across the island. Again, this is not something that we find on the KRS, along with the Gotlandic case endings. That's also weirdly missing on the stone. So the word, for example, for ship on the KRS should be written skipum if it was Gotlandic and not only just skip as we see on the stone. Wolter also points out that modern Gotlandic dialect often switch out the A at the end of the word to E instead. For example, gone or borta in Swedish is pronounced as borte in Gotland. On the KRS, we find the word fiske, and he claims that this is a connection showing that this is Gotlandic. Still, medieval Gotlandic runestone seems to keep the A at the end of words anyway. Williams used, for example, stone G39 as an example to demonstrate this. And all runestones in Sweden are catalogued and they have a distinct letter and a number. So the G in this case means that the stone is Gotlandic and it has number 39. And you can look up all the stones, all the runestones in Sweden and rune inscription in a database that's hosted by the National Heritage Board. And I will link this again in the show transcript if you want to go and look everything this up yourself. Now, G39 is not the only example. On top of that, we also have G255, G240, and G393, and so on and so on. Then there's the issue. On Gotland, the word stone is written as stein, but on the KRS, it's written as sten. So again, we see something that clearly differs from what we would expect from a medieval Gotlandic language compared to what we actually find on the KRS runestone. With all this in mind, the argument that the author of the KRS is from 14th century Gotland is quite dead and gone. What's left to look at is, the dotted R, as Wolter calls them. But if you want to look up what a dotted R is, don't use that term. Look up stone runes, as scholars refer to these types of runes. So on the KRS, we do seem to find stone R's. While their use in the Gotlandic language is intriguing, their appearance on the KRS could be explained by reasons other than a Gotlandic connection. Wolter also claimed to have found a stone rune on stone G282, but here I have to agree with Thorgun Snelldal that this is a result from flaking, not an intentional stung. And again, the creator of the KRS could likely just add these stings for, artistic effect licensing, so to say. There's other reasons why they could have added these so-called dots. Numbers and runes. So, to sum up our findings so far, the text and the runes used don't match with what we see in 14th century Sweden. So, the case for this being an authentic medieval runic text becomes less convincing as we continue to tally up the evidence. Each piece we add to the equation seems to subtract from the stone's authenticity. Now, let's shift our focus to the numbers engraved on the stone. Much like the language, these numerals stands out as anomalies, elements that don't quite fit into the historical equation we're trying to solve here. First, the numbers on the stones are written with a sort of pentatic runes. A symbol is used to represent each of the base 10 Arabic numerals. One looks like an uppercase version of the Greek letter gamma, so it's a straight line and a vertical line on the top right side. Then a perpendicular line is added for each number that you go up until you reach the number 5. At 5, the symbol starts to look like an uppercase P instead. Then a vertical line is added for each numeral until you reach the ending of 9. A vertical line with a circle on top represents 0. And I want to make something extremely clear here. The runic type numbers found on the KRS are not medieval. There is no medieval text or rune carving using this type of pentatic numbers. The earliest known instance of the use of the KRS numeral is found in the practice sheet of Edvard Larsson, and that's dated to 1885. And this sheet also contains the version of the KRS or Hassela runes. We later learned that Scott Wolter claims that the KRS are created by Cistercian monks, making the pentatic runes actually even stranger, because the Cistercians monks, they had their own numeral system that they developed. So how did you write numbers in Sweden during the early Middle Ages? Well, as Marit Åhlén points out, with quite a bit of effort. Numbers were written out in almost all cases if Latin numerals were not in use. So if you would like to write that something happened in the year 1350, like on the medieval Gotlandic runestone G293, it would have been quite a mouthful. The author wrote the year on the stone as 1000 years and 300 years and 50 years. And we see the same practice in mainland Sweden, for example on SM 114 and VG 210. It's almost as if the carver were paid by the rune. And the same goes for another numeral on the stone G293. And in that case, they're referring to the birth of the biblical Adam, which according to the stone happened 5,201 year before the birth of Christ. Again, the numbers are all spelled out. They don't shorten it. It's 5,201 years in the same form. There is, of course, a single exception to this, and that's on mainland Sweden on the stone DR 366. And in that case, they did not write out the number in words, but instead used Latin numerals. The same goes for the longest runic text we have, Codex Runicus, and this is a set of laws originating from Scania written on vellum with runes around the year 1300 CE. The most common practice during this time was simply to, again, write out the numbers. And if we look back to the Viking Age, we see the same practice of writing numerals as text. We still see this practice in the Swedish medieval letters from this period. The only difference is that Latin numerals tend to be a bit more common when it comes to dates and years. But if Latin numbers aren't used, well, then the year, amount of money, etc. is all spelled out. What we learn here is that if you find yourself back in time working as a scribe, make sure to charge per letter. And with all of this said, there are cases where runes were used to symbolize numbers in a way. These can be found in the Scandinavian version of the Easter table, a computation method developed in the Catholic Church to know when Easter was supposed to be celebrated, but also to keep track on other celebrations or events you must participate in during the year. So it's a sort of calendar where the runes are used as arbitrary symbols, not really numbers in that sense. And the majority of these type of calendars or perpetual calendars in Sweden are wooden staffs. An alternative version can also be found in a table format, often referred to in Sweden as a Easter table, and these had 19 columns and 28 rows. And the earliest known version of the runic calendar are from the 14th century. However, the vast majority of the almanacs we have preserved are from the 1500s and later, still using runes as arbitrary symbols. The staffs consist of golden numbers in this case. It's the younger Futhark with 3 runes invented just for this computation device. And these represent a 19-year moon cycle. It takes about 19 years for a new moon to appear on the same day. Again, then the first 7 runes are repeated 52 times to represent the weeks of the years. The crux here is to use the rune staff or the Easter table. You must know the golden year and the Dominical or Sunday letter. If you have these two, you can calculate when Easter should occur. And the upside with the table computation is that you can also use it to refer to a year within the Easter table using the golden year and the Sunday letter of that year. Another bonus is that this chart covers around 532 years, allowing people to refer to a year between 1114 and 1671 in the version we have of this Easter almanac. And we do have a few examples of medieval rune inscriptions where the text indeed refer to the Easter tablet. For example, on stone G171 commemorates a church fire in Heide on Gotland. And in the last line we can read, then H was the Sunday stave and the S the prime stave in the 13th row. So if we go to the Easter table and look for the S rune in the 13th column, on the line with the H rune, we can learn that the year of the fire was 1492. Another example of the use of the Easter table is on G78, which tells us when a house remodeling was completed. In that case, it was, and then H was the Sunday stave and K in the 13th row. And if we look at our chart, we can see that the kitchen renovation was completed in 1478. Every reference to the Easter table followed this formula. We get Sunday letter, the prime or golden number, and then what column to ensure that we actually get the correct year. Now, in the Hooked X, Wolter claimed that there are secret codes, there are several of them, hidden on the KRS. One is supposedly a repetition of the year 1362 that we find on the stone. Wolter mentioned that by using the U rune to the left side in line 9 and the L rune on line 4, except it's on line 3, combined with the pentatic rune 8, we get the year 1362 on the Easter table. One of Wolter's claims regarding the KRS is that it was a sort of land claim. So the authors feared that someone would come there and then alter the year by changing one of the pentatic numerals, moving the date of the claim to another century or so. A huge flaw, as you might see, is that pentatic runes were not used during this time or at all in Sweden. Also, it's much harder to change a date that's written out in plain text, and if you add the reference to the Easter table, it would be basically impossible to change it without destroying the stone itself. Now, to support this idea of repeated dates in medieval Sweden and that the KRS is authentic due to that, Wolter refers to two stones on Gotland with the designation G99 and G100. The unfortunate reality here is that it's only G99 that actually has dual dates. First as 1400 years and 1 year less than 50 years. And then in that year, K was the prime stave and the R the Sunday in the 11th row. In fact, G99 is more or less the only stone we have that has a repetition of the year. Note here also that the carver used the exact same formula we see on every other inscription on Gotland that we have preserved. You can also check my work on this. Again, the Swedish National Heritage Boards offer a searchable service of all known runic inscriptions found to date. Another issue with Wolter's claim is that the version of the KRS U rune. All runestones on Gotland use the U rune found in the Futhark. So it would be quite odd that people trained in a Gotlandic setting would all of a sudden differ on key runes used during this period. But as we already covered, the Hassela script is a 1800 creation. So the sum of all of this is that the KRS differ significantly from the material found on mainland Sweden and Gotland during the 14th century. The use of Larsson's pentatic runes is another thing that points to this being a 19th century creation of the KRS, that we suddenly find a stone that differs so much from all known material is a rather crucial indicator that this was created much later in history. I also want to point out that the book we found in Öhman's possession, the one that contained information on runes and the medieval language, also have a section on the old calendars. The Easter table has also been in different prints since at least 1626, when Olle Worm published a copy of this Easter chart in his book on Danish calendars. So both the use and the calculation of dates are well within reason to have been understood and utilized by Olof Öhman or a person that he might be cooperating with. Kensington Runestone and archaeology. How about we shift a little and look at the archaeological aspects and findings regarding the stone? Are there any? And the answer here is, again, no. Professor Fader points out in his book Archaeological Oddities that there isn't a single archaeological trace of Scandinavians in Minnesota during the 1300s. There are no signs of camps, trash, lost item, or anything connected to Swedish or Norwegian medieval explorers. From an archaeological perspective, we know that this is undoubtedly an archaeological oddity. Finds of the Vikings' presence in northern Canada can be found throughout the area where the short-lived settlement was. And the lack of Scandinavian artifacts in the area isn't due to a lack of trying either. Fader and Kehoe also mentions excavations that's been done in first 1899 and then in 1964 in the area where the stone was found. And Kehoe also mentioned in her book that further tests and surveys has been carried out both in 1981 and 2001. You might argue that a small encampment would not appear or be found in the archaeological material, but that's simply not true. Archaeologists do find nomadic temporary encampments all the time. Specifically, we find fire hearth in many cases. And there are also a large amount of trash humans have a tendency leaving behind, well, since the dawn of time, basically. And as an example, if you hike up in the northest part of Sweden and you know what to look for, you can actually find these temporary encampments in the landscape even today. It's just not possible that a party of 30-some people would come to an area and not leave a single item behind or create a single hearth. Since they took the time to carve a whole slab of stone full of runes, it strongly talks against these ninja-trained Scandinavians. A runestone is not something you just bash out during the lunch break. 10 of them even died and must have been buried, or maybe they were cremated, but that also leave archaeological material. Some trying to get around this by claiming that it was Native Americans attacking and were killed, not the explorers. Still, even then it would have been good practice to at least put together a mass grave, as we see in the aftermath of the Battle of Visby on Gotland that took place in 1361, for example. And it might be a bit surprising that Alice Kehoe is a rather respected anthropologist, especially since she promotes the idea that the Keres is a genuine 14th century artifact to this day. As recently as 2016, she proposed the stone as authentic, ignoring all the things that doesn't fit and relying heavily on outdated information or faulty assumption that we already covered in this essay. Remember that a degree doesn't necessarily protect you against bad ideas if critical thinking is not applied. You might counter here that the stories about Vinland were considered fiction for a very long time and then proved to be an accurate description or somewhat accurate description of what happened. The key difference here is that Newfoundland turned out to have real artifacts, proving that the Vikings visited the area, even if it was briefly. We're not talking about some century-long occupation. No, we're talking about a settlement maybe lasting tops 5 decades at most. Many scholars argue that the settlement found in Newfoundland for maybe about 10 years or so. The Kensington Runestone and geology. Now we come to an area where Scott Wolter could have me beaten. The stone's geology. I could add a quip here regarding agates, but I would try to refrain from this. No, I'm not a geologist, but luckily I have a couple geologists around me. One part of Wolter's and others' arguments is that the stone is authentic based on the idea that the weathering proves the stone to be of proper age. However, as geologist Dan Fallow told me in a personal communication, quote, "Weathering has no universal constant rate. It varies with pH, temperature, moisture, energy regime, and mineralogy. Even when you restrict mineralogy, you still have every other issue." Depending on the environmental conditions, you could try to use soil weathering or clay formations to date something, but this would be highly uncertain on an object already removed from the soil. I recommend reading Michael Myszlowicz's 2010 paper and Harold Edwards' 2020 paper for a more in-depth breakdown of the geological claims regarding the Kensington Runestone. Now, anthropologist Andy White wrote a fine blog post discussing the calcite weathering found in the bottom left corner of the KRS with input from Edwards that also add a lot of valuable information regarding using the weathering we see on the stone as an indicator of its age. Now, we can summarize Wolter's claim into 2 points. Wolter's first piece of geological evidence is comparing the pyrite in the KRS and the confirmed hoax stone called the AVM stone, and that's a granite gneiss boulder with runes that was created in 1985 by a couple of students. Now, Wolter claims that this comparison shows that the KRS stone must have been made some at least 20 years before Olos Öhman discovered the stone. Secondly, Scott Wolter also compared biotite found in the KRS with gravestones in Maine. Wolter claims that this comparison again shows the KRS is much older than 200 years due to the weathering of the mica minerals found in the KRS stone. Michlovich raised several concerns regarding these comparisons made by Wolter, and other geologists have also determined that the comparison between different rocks is, questionable at best. Even I raised an eyebrow regarding that statement. And a tombstone in the coastal Maine would have a quite different weather and climate than Minnesota that's located in the central US. Why Wolter shows this comparison is a bit unclear. Wolter also used a very minimal sample size on top of all of this. In his first comparison, we have one stone and both are of different types. And his second comparisons, he bases analysis on only 3 grave slabs that he found in Maine. It might be interesting if the tests were based on several more gravestones or slabs and different stones, or the same stone at least in the same and located in the same environment. A cause for concern here, however, is that nobody else seemed to use this method or seemed to try using this method to date carvings on stone. I mean, it would be amazing, close to a holy grail, to be able to create a method for absolute dating a carved object in stone. Just imagine what we could be able to find out if we had this ability. But the lack of people pursuing this method might indicate that this method does not work as Scott Wolter hopes. River kings without rivers. Another glaring issue with the stone is its location. We learned on the stone that the medieval explorers were 14 days from the shore or the coast, but Solem in Douglas County, where the rock was found, is very far from any coast. When Öhman supposedly found the KRS, ships could take the Erie Canal to travel between the Atlantic and the Great Lakes, which would bring the shore a bit closer to Solem and Douglas County. But this route definitely didn't exist in the 14th century. This means that the explorer would have had to either push their ships over land for, quite a far bit to get to the Great Lakes and then sail in there to get closer to Douglas County, or they would have traveled solely on foot, a journey definitely more than 14 days away. Both operations would have been quite an undertaking and would definitely has left evidence of their journeys and visits. And as shown in Europe along the river tradeways that was operated by the Vikings in the 11th century, we find a lot of artifacts and evidence that Scandinavian or people within the Viking world were operating along these rivers and trade routes. So while the text on the Kensington Runestone makes sense in a 19th century context, it would not have made sense for a person in the 13th or in the 14th century here. Here comes the Templars. But why was the Kensington Runestone created then? And let's deal with the more imaginative version first, and then I will get to the more grounded or probable version. Now, according to Richard Nielsen and Scott Wolter, the Kensington Runestone was created as part of some sort of land claim, but most importantly, it was created by the Templars. Yeah, those Templars. And of course, the Holy Grail seemed to be involved. Do you remember when I mentioned there was a couple of hidden codes on the stone when discussing the numerals? Well, according to Wolter's 2009 book, there is another code, of course. But by using a microscope, Wolter claims to have seen hidden punch marks and strokes on certain characters. You can get the following sentence by adding these characters or words or symbology later, according to Richard Nielsen and Wolter at least. It goes, quote, Grail, these 10 men have wisdom. The 10 men are with Holy Spirit. Now, the issue with this supposed hidden code is that it builds heavily on Nielsen and Wolter's assumptions, attempted translation, imagined translation, and their approach to symbolism from their subjective mind. Could there have been a hidden message on the stone? Sure, I mean, why not? But this sentence does not prove that the stone is from the 14th century. And I looked at a recent high-resolution 3D scan of the stone and could not really see these markings that Wolter was talking about. Maybe they are there, maybe they aren't. Scott is welcome to publish more details about them, but again, the fact that there might or might not be a second message on the stone does not prove it is from the 14th century. Now, Wolter is trying to present the idea that a Knights Templar went to the US, maybe to hide the Grail or Jesus bloodline, and then have stayed since and acting a little bit like the man behind the curtain. But how does the island of Gotland fit in all of this? Well, according to Wolter, the Templars had a base there, or at least a connection through the Cistercian monastery operating on the island. In, again, the book The Hooked X, Wolter speculates that a Cistercian monk from Gotland created the KRS. But as we have seen so far throughout this episode, this is very far from what could have been the reality. Now, you might wonder why the Cistercians and the Templars are connected to the Grail idea. It all goes back to Arthurian legends, especially the work Prose Lancelot. In Questa del Saint Grail, we get the beginnings of what would become the legends about the Holy Grail. And this particular story seems to have been influenced by Cistercian ideals and values that would later influence the Templars. For a more in-depth exploration of the Grail story, I recommend reading Karen Pratt and Marco Nievergeld's articles on the topic. And something interesting here to note is that according to Stephen Knight, the rise of Arthurian Romance works can be connected to a decline in the population's enthusiasm regarding the Crusades. So in a sense, the legends about the Grail could be viewed as, well, a propaganda tool to promote the Crusades and the ideas that the Cistercians and the Crusades promoters wanted to inflict on the population. To support his claim that the Templars and Cistercians controlled the religious life on Gotland, Wolter claims that the churches have Templar crosses within them. The issue with this claim is that, well, Wolter seems to have confused the Templar cross with the consecration cross. These type of consecration crosses can be found throughout the medieval world and, well, definitely in medieval churches. And these were put up where the bishop spreads holy water during the consecration and consist often of a cross within a circle. Now there's different versions of it, but that's the most common one, especially on Gotland. Wolter also misidentifies a painting of Saint Peter for Bernard of Clairvaux in Lairborough Parish Church for some reason. And a quick lament on my part here. It doesn't really add much to the story, but I have to bring it up. Wolter claims that there are 6 defense towers on Gotland. This is incorrect. There are 9 confirmed defense towers, and then we have additional 9 towers, depending a little bit on how you want to define a defense tower within the Swedish language. It's a bit of just how to define it with the words to be used, but it's a bit over the top here. But on top of these 18 towers, we have records of 5 more, but we don't really have hard evidence of their existence. We just have mentions of them. And another problematic claim from Wolter is that the Teutonic Knights were active in Gotland and part of the KRS expedition. Now, this is a other order and is again separate from the Knights Templar. Now, this order was founded by German merchants to support the war in the Holy Land. But after the defeat in Acre, the order would later form an independent state in Poland, and they have a beautiful castle in Malbork that I highly recommend you visiting. But the order was active in the Baltic area and were having a sort of crusade, especially towards Estonia and Latvia and that part of the Baltic area. Now, so while the order was active in the Baltic Sea, they were not present in Gotland until 1398. And it was the year they invaded the island to protect merchants from pirate activity, especially the German merchants, of course. The island was under Teutonic control until 1408, when it was returned to the Kalmar Union that was governing Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. So the order's activity does not really fit with Wolter's claims, nor the date of 1362 that we find on the stone. Why and who? So, if we consider everything that we have talked about for the past hour or so, it's really hard to make an argument that the stone is from the 14th century. Everything we have found so far points to a modern date. So, who made it? Well, that part is slight mystery at least. Most likely, it was Olof Öhman, but he might not have been acting alone in this. 2 more persons can be connected to Olof Öhman and the stone. We have a defrocked priest named Sven Fogelblad and a man called John P. Gran, all immigrants from Sweden. In 1967, in an interview later transcribed by the Minnesota Historical Society, Gran's children would admit that their father, together with Öhman and Fogelblad, created the stone. A strange accusation if there was no truth from it, especially from the children of Gran, who might want to keep their father in some revere. But how did the world look like around the supposed creation of the Kensington Runestone? We have to remember that the creation would not have been long after a period where national romance and a fascination of the Vikings were taking place in Sweden. Societies were created to promote manly ideas and the brave exploring Vikings. And on top of this, there was a sort of Viking revival taking place across Europe and the US. Books like Fritjof Saga by the Swedish author Tegnér and other books were published, and they were popular, and they were read by many people across Europe, America, Sweden, the United States. And claims of Vinland really being the Americas and the Scandinavians arrived here before Columbus was theorized by, for example, Professor Rasmus B. Anderson and Gustav Storm. The later writings can be found in Swedish newspapers that was published for Swedish immigrants in the US. And the creation would also have coincided with the World Fair in Chicago that were celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus arriving in America. So there was a lot of Vikings on a lot of people's minds during this period. And according to the children of Johan Gran, Öhman and others, seems to have thought it was a excellent time to pull a prank on, well, society as a whole. They are quoted to saying that they want to maybe even make a fool of those that's more educated than them. And it kind of fits with the description we have of Öhman and the other that was involved in this little hoax, so to say. And I also want to mention that archaeologist Carl Fagan makes a connection between the KRS and the Dakota War of 1862. And this war were taking place almost a stone throw away from where Öhman would later come to live, and was only a few decades before he arrived in the area. And the aftermath and the war would still have been in an event that were engraved in people's mind that they talked about still. And Fagan writes that the date similarities, 1862, and the stones, 1362, might be a slight nod to the war if, well, the stone is a hoax, which it most likely is. But I think it's a nice little connection, but I'm not sure how accurate this speculation is. I think Fagan just included to show that if you want to make connections, you can make connections. So in light of all of this, the stone has played a more important role in modern history. In a way, the stone is more important as a reflection of American identity and how history is viewed when arriving in a new country, and maybe even to some extent on how immigrant is trying to keep a connection to their identity. And the stone can also be looked at in how it's been displayed in museum and what values and ideas this different exhibition represent. Is the stone or exhibition about migrations or people, or is it representing the idea of when and how the founding of the US took place? So while it not might be authentic, it can still serve as a way for us to explore our history and our connections to it, even if the events are much closer in time than first thought. And on that note, we close this case. We can, with extremely high confidence, say that this is a modern creation. And next time, we will be back investigating something else, something with a bit more aliens. But until then, please spread the word by leaving a positive review on platforms like iTunes, Spotify, or even better, recommend it to your friends. But reviews really do help. And if you want the sources or resources used to create this episode, you find everything, all the sources, on the episode transcript page on diggingupancientaliens.com. And if you want to support the show with, more than just reviews, you can become a patron or member. And by doing that, you get early content, you get bonus content, and to access this, head over to patreon.com/diggingupancientaliens. And if you want rather to use another support method, you can go to diggingupancientaliens.com/support and sign up for the membership portal. Or you can head over to the archaeologicalpodcastnetwork.com and you find a bunch of great shows and you can become a supporter over there too. If you want to contact me, it can be done through most social media sites or through the email you find on the website. Sandra Martelor created the intro music and our outro is by the amazing band called Trallskruv, who is going on tour, mostly in Sweden, but that's another issue. And they're singing their song Tinfoil Hat. Links to both of these artists will be found in the show notes. Now, until next time, keep shoveling that science.
Men jag skyddar mig för jag har foliehatt. Och så säger ni det är en galen fantasi att Engels manipulerar oss med telepati. Ni tycker att jag redan är besatt, men jag skyddar mig för jag har foliehatt.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to this episode. Remember that we have a subscription going on. You can become a patron or other subscriber for as little as $2.50 per episode. Go to diggingupancientaliens.com/support. That is, go to diggingupancientaliens.com/support to read more information and sign up right there.